Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dragon Talk. I am Greg Tito, and I'm joined by Shelley Mazanoble.
Hello.
And we have a third person here.
A little awkward.
Arnie Niekamp. Hello.
Hey.
Hi. Look, it doesn't have to be awkward. We can make it work with the three of us.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. Said the guy
wheel,
in front of a
Tito.
toilet paper drone and an upside-down forehead man. Full stream?
Yeah, the latest You Don't Know Jack game that I worked on, the subtitle is You Don't Know Jack Full Stream. It's sort of like the premise is that it's on a new kind of streaming service like Netflix competitor.
The problem is with your head the way it was like, does it say full?
God.
It says full ream, I think, which is.
Look, yeah. Yes, exactly. I will let the listener fill in the rest of that.
As we should.
Full Stream is actually a very clever name.
I know.
Yeah.
It is. It's good stuff.
Part of what we wanted to do with that, and I know we don't really need to talk about You Don't Know Jack that long, but
no, I want to. It's good stuff.
Really, just the idea of like someone trying to do an up and coming streaming service and just making these small but really significant mistakes with their marketing. Like, so they're just sort of like, full stream. Yeah, that seems like a great slogan for our streaming service, not realizing that it sounds a little bit like pee.
Yeah, I went there.
So many people listening may know you from Hello from the Magic Tavern, which is an amazingly fun and funny podcast. We'll get to that in a second, but now, I mean, let's talk a little bit about what your role is at You Don't Know Jack, because
job.
That's fascinating. As a fellow game company, this makes sense.
Yeah, I work for Jackbox Games, and I've been here for over a decade, and we make I know, a long time. You lift your head up one day, and you're like, oh wait, hold on, I've been here a long time. That's my life. Where's my? But it's very exciting, working in games, working in kind of like collaborative games or what could be considered party games is really a lot of fun. So we do, Jack is like our classic like trivia game, but we also do a lot of games that people can play, like Quiplash, where people are just like typing jokes on their phone and they show up on the screen and they, everybody votes on what's the funniest. Drawful, which is a very sort of a very weird, like sort of like if Pictionary just kept getting weirder and weirder as it went along.
It does. It definitely
It usually does.
Yeah.
Inspired by real Pictionary games, I'm sure.
And my role has changed over the years, but I'm mostly like a game designer, sometimes director. I do a lot of writing. So like I directed Drawful. I directed Trivia Murder Party, which is a trivia game hosted by a serial killer who doesn't he really is a serial killer, but he's also just sort of like, it's really like if someone on YouTube that was just sort of like, I'm like someone trying to be a YouTube influencer, but they also just happen to be a serial killer, and they don't realize that like it's a little weird that their serial killing tendencies are creeping into the show that they're trying to host.
Well, I mean, you got to have a side hustle. You can't serial kill all the time.
It's true.
It's true.
I mean, doesn't pay the bills. So, so what does it mean though to be a director on a video game?
That's a very good question. And honestly, I think it really changes from place to place. We're kind of our own weird little thing. So directing here usually means you're just kind of like running sort of like running the game, basically. Like it's often also someone that's leading up game design, a fair amount of like editorial. And, also since it's usually small teams, a good amount of like project management as well. It's basically just like taking a small team, helping, with like a team of anywhere from like 5 to 10 people making a party game in a couple of months. And we release 5 new games every year with a shockingly small team. So it's kind of everybody does a little bit of everything.
That's crazy.
Fun.
It actually reminds me a lot of what the D&D and Avalon Hill kind of theme is all about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because Dungeon Mayhem, well, it wasn't 4 or 5 months, as you're saying, for some of your games, but it was. Was it in 4 or 5 months?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't count the time it actually was at the printer. But
right. I think
from the second that we played it to the second it went off to the printer, that was only That was like February to June.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess your role might be
I'm
game
kind of,
director.
like, thinking I might want to change my title.
Yeah, I think you should.
Director.
Yeah, because you didn't design it, but you definitely like were the project manager of getting all the
I
artwork
worked with
and
the design team.
yeah, did the play testing, all that stuff. As
Nathan
well
might
as,
have an issue if I change my title to director.
let's
I
just
feel
do
like
it.
that
We're
might
just
be
gonna
his
do it.
title.
Yeah, I mean, I think Arnie would agree.
Okay. If Arnie says.
You definitely put my name. I co-sign it.
All right. Love it.
So were you always a gamer? Did you always play games like Dungeons and Dragons or anything else?
Party games?
Yeah, I've always loved games. I especially like. I'm not really a particularly competitive person, so I always really like games where it's like either collaborative, or the enjoyment is less wrapped up in like winning or losing and more on sort of the weird fun you have along the way. I played a fair amount of Dungeons and Dragons when I was little. I was kind of one of those kids, I'm a bit older. But when I was a kid, I remember the classic like red Advanced Dungeons and Dragons manual, like the one that I feel like you not like if you're watching Freaks and Geeks, not like the old crudely hand-drawn monster manual era, but kind of right after that.
The red box, that 1984-ish type era, yeah.
And it was a time when it was like harder to find the cool things that you wanted to do, like music, books, TV, anything. So you just kind of had to, if you found somebody that was into something cool, you had to really latch onto that person and be like, look. And honestly, I played Dungeons and Dragons with a kid on my street that I kind of didn't like. Like nothing against him, but I was just sort of like, he's all right. But you know what?
He plays.
He likes Dungeons and Dragons, so I'm going to go play with him. And that was great. And it's crazy now just how much it's evolved since then. And I don't get to play. I haven't really dove in and played as much in a long time. Or when I do, I'm that kind of what some people might find annoying, that kind of dilettante player that's just kind of there to have fun. And if I mess up the rules, someone will explain to me what I've gotten wrong. But it's a big tent, so a lot of different people can come in and play and have fun at different skill levels. It seems like.
Yeah, and I think that the type of player that you're describing, maybe at one time, might have been get an eye roll or two, but I think more and more folks at the table are excited to have people like that who are drop in, kind of understand the basic frameworks of the game, and everyone's there to help with the rules and make sure it all feels like it's everyone's having the same kind of balanced fun that's happening there. But I think with the rise of streaming and podcasting and things like that, people are just like, oh yeah, no, it's like get to the fun parts.
It should be fun.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Agreed.
It's good. I mean, that's what I like. I like playing any game, any complicated tabletop game or something. It's always good. It's always good to have that friend that's like, all right, I'll read the instruction.
Yes.
Oh yes.
And then everyone, every game I play, I kind of turn someone into the dungeon master. Someone is the person that is running the game. And that's sort of my, probably not a good, that's my philosophy on a lot of life. Just find someone around you, make them the dungeon master, have them figure out what you're supposed to do.
Like the kid in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
You're like, oh yeah, his superpower is reading the rules and understanding them and orchestrating the game for me.
And he got a lot out of it too, because maybe he was an annoying kid but he ended up having a cool friend because of D&D.
No. And you know what? I'm going to be honest. Maybe he it's probably a draw which of us was cooler.
You both got something.
He might have felt exactly the same way, I don't like that Arnie guy, but you know what? He'll play Dungeons and Dragons with me.
It's the bridge to friendship.
It is.
Exactly.
What do you remember what those sessions were like when you played with him?
We were pretty young, and also again, you just didn't have much to draw on. You kind of read the book and you take it very literally. It sort of reminds me a lot of beginning. I do a lot of improv stuff, like you said, I have an improv podcast. reminds me a lot of like when you're first taking your first steps into the improv comedy world, or trying to understand it by just reading like some of the older like improv books of like exercises, and you take it all very literally, and like you have to do it step by step by step, and until you can kind of see another game or play with someone that really has sort of played for a while, or until, obviously like the books have gotten a lot better, like a lot richer. When we played, it was almost like we were almost just playing like a crude walk around a map. What's in this room? This is the thing it says that it is in this room. What's in this room? Because we didn't know, we didn't have anything to base it off of besides like, thinking of it almost like an old Atari game where you're wandering from room to room, finding loot.
That's so funny because I had an experience recently where I've been playing with people who hadn't played since that era either. And he brought in all of his old modules to show off and be like, oh, these, this was Hidden Shrine of Tomoe-chan and all these things that he just happened to have. And I, geeked out over them and was super excited about them. And then someone else asked him, be like, oh, who's the dungeon master in your group when you played like that? And he was like, oh, we kind of traded off, and he was like, oh, were there any like really good ones? And he's like, I mean, all you really needed to do was read. Like you just read what was in the next room and you did it, and there was none of the kind of characterization and stuff that is, really popular in how to play now. And I was really taken aback. I'm like, really? Like, no, you just, and then they treated it the same way that you're talking about. It was just you go from room to room and you kill the monsters, and that's about it. And it was not a storytelling device or an improv device like we use it now.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it's so cool that there are so many places that you can go to listen to people's games, to watch people's games, like either just to like enjoy it as entertainment, but also like I think every game you watch like opens up more doors in your own head of like, oh, that's a way I can engage with this game, or it doesn't have to be this, or even just seeing, someone enjoying it and really bringing to the game who they are and how much that like changes what the game is, like how each person, like who you are and how you play, that's what the game is. That's what makes the game.
Yeah that's true. So when did you start doing comedy improv stuff?
I went to grad school for creative writing and had a little bit more free time on my hands when I was supposed to be writing, like the Great American Novel. And I basically just fell in with like a college improv group, which I always refer to as like a bad college improv group. And I don't mean that to like be insulting, only in the way that like, at least maybe in that time period.
What was the name? What was the name? That's how you can really gauge the quality of the improv group.
Brace yourself. It was called Comedy Corner.
Oh,
not even a pun.
Improv.
I know.
Group?
So
That's
it's
like a club, maybe, but
yeah, I think it was actually. I mean, it was a legacy name. Like I guess it had been around for a long time, like before the concept of funny names existed.
I thought you were gonna say, when you said brace yourself, I thought that was the name, and I was like, that's not bad.
No.
But no,
yeah, that's actually right.
Yeah, brace yourself.
Comedy
Coming at you.
We were called Brace Yourself. It was a group of, we were all chiropractors and we
or orthodontists.
Oh, I thought they were all going to be like Eminem, impersonators. Brace yourself.
Oh,
in the
well, we
I
all
just
went somewhere different.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the beauty of improv.
Exactly.
Well, that's interesting. So so instead of getting it down on paper, you were being creative in the moment. And was this in Chicago?
This is in Arizona, actually.
Oh, no way.
Tucson. And I mean, I think it's like writing is very lonely, and I think I realized that even though, it wasn't always the funniest thing in the world, it was just what I was looking for. I was looking for community. I was looking for creating something collaboratively in the moment. And it was just so fun to kind of just throw yourself off of the cliff of like not knowing what was going to happen next. And, being with other people while you're creating it, and also getting that immediate feedback from the audience instead of like, writing a really long story and then later at best getting someone being like, yeah, that was good. Like even if someone is really excited, it's like, okay, well, great. But it's hard to compete with like a laughing audience.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I had that similar experience as a playwright and writing of stuff where it's like you spend, you up until 2 or 3 in the morning getting something done, and you're like, oh God, I can't wait. And then someone reads it and they're like, it's pretty good.
Or you don't know.
Maybe change all this, and also the whole premise is bad, but it's good. And you're like, oh well, you don't really get that adulation that you get from a live audience.
What you guys are like the scary part to me about improv is what you're both saying you love about it is that immediate reaction. Because my biggest fear is that immediate reaction is not a good one.
It can be quite bracingly bad. I mean, there's no question.
Brace yourself.
Brace yourself.
Oh, that's what that. All right, now it all makes sense.
Yeah, and I don't know why. I mean, I think for me, the thing that is scariest is having that permission, feeling like you have that permission to be on that stage. And then when you're on that stage, it's scary, but it's not as scary. And I don't know. I think that was just something I was always looking for. And I think that's also kind of why, I don't know if it's hokey that I keep in my mind bringing it back to Dungeons and Dragons.
No, I was doing that too.
Yeah, I think that's also part of what's like really great about playing role-playing games is it gives you a permission to play these roles, to act out these, to be something other than yourself and put yourself out there. And I think most people want that. And, and they even have that bravery. They just need like that excuse to kind of get onto the quote unquote stage of the story.
And I think there is also like in general, like when I feel like an improv audience is kind of already set up to enjoy it and laugh, and like they're not there to be like, they're not there generally to heckle you. That's always been my experience as an audience member for improv. Never have done it myself.
Right. People go there with
they want
to, yeah, exactly. They want to laugh. They want to have a good time.
And the same with D&D is, you have, like you said, like you have permission to play these roles, but you also have like the support of the other people on stage with you, like you would in a D&D game, and you're kind of taking turns setting people up and letting them, have that really funny punchline and vice versa, and kind of like D&D. So yes,
absolutely. I mean, I've never been brave enough to do like much solo performing, because that seems what's truly scary.
Yeah, that's scary too.
Just you, but when you have a group of people and you have your fellowship, so to speak, like you're all there together. Like if I don't have something funny, someone else will. Or if I'm really flaming out in a scene, running out of things and about to crash, like someone can either just edit it and be like, this has to be over.
Right. Move on. New scene.
Or can kind of come in and make it great. It's like you have a bunch of minds together are funnier and smarter and more interesting than just one.
Yeah. Yeah. The solo stuff is very hard, as for that reason, because it's just that relationship with you and the audience, and if that goes sour, it can very quickly be like. And then I've done the self-editing thing on my own, and instead of having someone else come in and be like, "All right, we're done," I'm like, "Okay, no, this set is over. Goodbye, thank you."
Oh, I just got a phone call.
And oddly enough, you get the biggest reaction when you're bombing and you get off the stage. People are like, "Yeah,
yeah,
like,
get off the stage."
You're like, at least I got something.
They're a meaner audience.
Some applause.
Like a lot of times, the comedy club, like the ones that are there to watch a solo performer, like there's often that feeling of like, you better be funny, make me laugh, man. There's that mix.
There can be that jerk that's in the room that does that, but in general, it's similar to the improv audiences where people want to laugh, and they're also
they're also like
they paid to see people come up on stage and do that.
They better start laughing.
Sure, but then they also know that
they're going to turn on you.
At least the shows that I did, there was always another person who's going to come up and hopefully, shift the tone and things like that. So people weren't ever like too
I'm not
combative. I luckily never had a
it.
heckler or anything like that. So I wasn't really
I hate them.
equipped. But then I had people who were extremely skilled at that and actually made that part of their act to a certain extent. I was like, oh gosh, that seems crazy. Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think, what can be great about that is that it's you're in a very suddenly you're in a very present moment, a surprising moment. And like the part of me that loves improv is the part of me that loves when you see a stand-up having to deal with something that like kicks them out of their routine. But you certainly don't want to encourage people to heckle to get you to that place.
Right.
But I will say though, some of my most cherished live improv memories are when something crazy like probably one of the best shows I ever did, like in a smallish theater, was one where like halfway through someone ran across the front of the stage because the place was packed and there was no way to kind of get through. Like people's feet were essentially on the front of the stage. Someone ran from the bar across the front of the stage with their hands over their mouth, vomit like
Nope.
spewing out between their
Oh,
fingers onto the stage, just leaving like a trail of vomit all the way across.
That's my worst nightmare.
And we're like in the middle of doing some scene, and it literally like everyone in the whole place is like, what just happened? And we kind of someone made a joke, and we're like, all right. And we basically just kind of like kept our sense of confidence. Like we acknowledged that it happened. We didn't just keep doing some scene like in a fake park stepping in vomit. It was like, okay, hey everybody, we just saw that. Let's quickly get someone to clean that up. And we, got it mopped up pretty quickly. And then we kind of went on and we did some scenes. Like, I think the scene maybe took place in a Walmart. So then from then on, whenever we did a scene that took place in a Walmart, someone pretended to come through vomiting. But even totally aside from any of jokes specifically about what we had just seen, at that point, the entire audience was like so in on the show because everyone was just like, we just saw something crazy and we are so excited like for anything that happens after that. And I have never since then, even like after having like some level of success or I've gotten to play for much bigger audiences, that is probably the most like enthusiastic and electric audience I've ever performed for. And it was just because someone threw up on the stage.
and you couldn't have planned it. If you tried to do that now, you're like, all right, I'm going to pay
never
you
know.
to get really drunk and throw up across the thing. It would feel not real and not. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, the flip side story I have of that, and I'm sorry if I'm just going on and on.
No, do it.
No, we like it.
Like like that's the thing. You want something spontaneous to happen, but you can't force it. And honestly, and you shouldn't like try too hard to invite it in. I remember doing a terrible improv show, like in a bar, that was not equipped to even have shows. Like it was really depressing. And we're on stage. We were once again like standing right next to the bathroom, pretty much. And when you're doing it, I don't know if people aren't as familiar with like live improv. Like oftentimes some of the cast is like standing on the side of the stage, kind of wait. They're not like in the show, but they're waiting to go in.
Yeah.
And someone very drunk kind of came up to me, and he said, "Hey, can I get in there?" And I thought he meant the bathroom because they're standing right next to the bathroom. And I was like, "Oh yeah, just go. You can go in the bathroom. I know we're in front of it. I'm sorry." And he's like, "No, can I get into the show?" He's like, "I just want to be a dog. I'll just sniff around a little bit."
What?
I was like, no. I said no. And afterwards, when I told the rest of the cast, they were like, "You should have let him in." I was like, no. You know what? If he just like makes a beeline and does that, you just like work with it, and maybe something great happens. But you don't like you don't just invite it in willy-nilly because it could go bad.
I've learned, his fault was asking for permission.
Right.
He should have been asking for forgiveness afterwards.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's also what you just said is great advice for a dungeon master.
Absolutely. When don't try to keep the integrity of what you're doing, but also keep the door open to something great happening and really rolling with
and
it.
don't try too hard to force something that might not be right. Just
Exactly. Yeah, it's a lot of it is listening. It seems like to me, like that's what a lot of improv is really just listening and honestly taking in what's happening and going with that. And it seems like a lot of what makes a good dungeon master. Like there are a lot of things that make a good dungeon master. But one of the things that I really value is someone that is really listening to what the players are doing and what is happening and kind of really like incorporating and weaving in those things instead of being like, yeah, I don't want that to be part of the story, or not because you don't like it, but just sort of like, yeah, I wasn't planning on this to happen. So let's not go down that path. I think really sort of rolling with that stuff is really fun.
Yeah.
And also one of the things I honestly, this is like a half-baked theory of mine, but I really think that like something about the dice is what makes Dungeons and Dragons so great. I'm realizing this is like I'm posing this as like a really smart theory, and I'm like, guys, I don't know if you thought about it,
But the
but
dice are important.
but it's
dice.
but like just the level of spontaneity that like brings into the game is so great.
Well, it's the unpredictability. I think that it's really important, and it allows not just the players to improvise, but the dungeon master to have to improvise, so that it becomes this moment. I mean, I always equate it to, if we're in speaking of the comedy improv kind of thing, it's like that. Oh, give us an idea from the audience type thing, where you get like a random thought that nobody on stage had thought of before, nobody in the audience had thought of before, except for this one person. And then it's like, all right, everything kind of builds from that spontaneous moment, right? And the dice serve that same purpose, I think, where like everybody's got their frameworks and what they might bring to the table, but no one knows what, are you going to get a 20? Are you going to get a 1? Are you going to get somewhere in between? And it's that element that brings like that. I don't know. That you're right. It makes it different than other just like story games.
Yeah, and also like I think the human, like people are so like naturally tend to make like binary choices, right? Where it's sort of like, what happened? Was it good or was it bad? But then the dice can have like all these like
spectrum
gradations in between of that can kind of like be not what you expect, that I think is really interesting.
I thought I had recently played in a game that Satine Phoenix DM'd.
Yeah.
And she has this really, I'm sure other DMs do it, but I've never played in a game with this, that if you roll a 1 on an attack, then she will tell you, she makes you roll damage. And she is like, now I'm going to tell you how you just hit yourself, basically. So then she gets like this little chance to like come up with like some funny little ditty, like you were about to fire your bow and like it got stuck in a cobweb and like
flung in your face
back at you or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you take damage from it. So I thought that was like very clever.
Yeah, it's cute.
And just another way to,
to mix it up too. And I like how different dungeon masters have different kind of, not necessarily crutches, but things that they lean on to be like, oh, this is my shtick, and this is how I do it.
I don't want to take damage, but I kind of appreciate it. Like, yeah, actually, that probably
is what
happened.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
So I feel like we've been dancing.
Oh, well, I was going to say, as someone who like loves like story and just weird things happening along the way more than like actually winning, like, man, I think bad rolls are such a gift, right? Like that's where the really fun stuff happens. Like if you go into the game and you're just like everything goes as planned, it's not as fun. It's kind of where the weird places where things go wrong and what happens from there that I think is where the really fun stuff happens. And I don't know, maybe it sounded like you were about to segue into talking about my podcast. So my podcast is almost like the whole premise of it is like it's all low. We should just call it all bad rolls. Like it's just bad decisions. Everything we try to do to make things better usually ends up like messing up in some weird way, and just constantly dealing with the consequences of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. So what I was going to say was like, we've been dancing around all these topics that are very specifically kind of, born true with Hello from the Magic Tavern. It really is like, it brings in all of what we're talking about here. So, for those folks who might not know, what would you your elevator pitch for what the podcast is? Actually, it's basically what your intro is every week.
Right.
But,
It is, yeah. I mean, I basically play myself. It's an entirely improvised comedy, chat show, fantasy epic. And the idea is, I play a fiction. I need to be careful to say a very fictionalized version of myself. Who fell through a dimensional portal behind a Burger King in Chicago into a magical land, luckily realized that he was still getting a slight Wi-Fi signal from the Burger King through the dimensional rift, and he decided to host a podcast in the tavern, interviewing adventurers and wizards and monsters. And to me, like the idea behind it is like, what if a person had this spectacular thing happen to them where they're suddenly in this magical land, but instead of going off and having a grand adventure and saving the world, they were like, you know what, this is finally my opportunity. This is really to start a podcast. I think people are really going to like this content. And it really has kind of spiraled out from there to about 200 episodes. And I think one of the central tricks of the show that people really like, that is also a very I think analogous to Dungeons and Dragons, is that everything is canon. Like everything is part of the story and it keeps on going. And that can be a dangerous thing to place on ourselves, because we're improvising and just making up silly and dumb things in the moment, but then we force ourselves to live with the consequences of those dumb jokes forever. We're collaboratively building this world, and if I'm trying to think of like a good family-friendly example to give, but this one's not too bad. Like, if wizards have two buttholes, that's just the way it is. That's just a fact of that world.
And was it Matt Young as Usador who first just said that as a throwaway joke, and you're like, well, it's canon now.
No, absolutely. I mean, we've also, also like one of the reasons we wanted to do it as like a real human in like a person from Earth in a magical world, with like really making it also about physically trying to operate a podcast in this world. And so like that allows us to have emails back and forth. So, people email the show and we read the emails, and like my co-hosts, a wizard and a talking badger, like misunderstand things from the emails. And sometimes those emails become huge parts of the story. Like someone had like a weird, like the grammar of one of their sentences was strange. And they're like talking about the character Usador the wizard saying, can the wizard do this? And they immediately jumped on it, and they were like, can the wizard? Oh, can the wizard is not my favorite wizard. And that just turned into a character named Can the Yellow, who's just another wizard in the world that is actually like a big part of the story. So someone's like random email turned into like a huge plot thread on the show.
That's super fun. And it sounds like, you're doing that role as the listening dungeon master for everything. Obviously you're cracking jokes just like everyone else is when you see the opportunity, but like you're the canon, that's being reflected out by being like, oh, and it's a great literary trope too, of having someone who's ignorant about what's happening in the world, and then they have to tell you, and then that means you can just get so much conversation and things happening from there too. So it has a lot of analogs to D&D, and then of course you bring in a lot of fantasy tropes that also are all there from D&D as well.
Yeah, I mean, it comes from like a sincere love of fantasy, and a sincere love of the things that are great about it and the things that sometimes are really silly and dumb. Like, we equally love both of those things. And so it's fun to kind of like make fun of weird things and subvert some things that we think are cliches that don't make sense, but then also really take advantage of like cool tropes and characters and types of creatures.
How did it get started? How did you pitch this, or how did it come about?
I had performed in Chicago in a show for about 10 years with my co-hosts, and I had a couple podcasts that were like had some small amount of success around Chicago at least, but never that much. And then I just had this idea of like a chat show that story just kind of started to seep into it and become more and more of a thing and sort of accumulated. And also I just knew that like, in improv, like when you're taking early improv workshops or just like rehearsing with your like group for the first time, doing like improvised interviews is actually a great form. Like it gives you a lot of support because you can kind of do a lot. They're like these very clear barriers, but you can kind of do a lot within that. And also as an interviewer, you can do a lot like with improvised interviews, because it makes it very easy for you to naturally like give traits to the characters you're interviewing by like the questions that you ask them. And it's actually like it's not as scary as like we were saying before, like getting up on stage. Like if you're improvising something in anything, you could like suddenly jump around and run around, and reality can change at every second. That can be intimidating, and for a performer, and sometimes for listeners, like they're not quite ready to follow you with all of that stuff right away. But an interview is something that people get right away, and so you can kind of then be very, very weird within that structure. And so I was thinking about that, and I basically I pitched the idea to my friend Adel, who plays the talking badger, not even really thinking we would do it, more just the kind of like, when sometimes you have ideas you think are clever and you're like, I'm probably not going to do that, but I gotta tell somebody about it. Like I have to I have to get that validation of like, yeah, that's a pretty funny idea.
Just like the writing classes of yore, right? You're like, oh yeah,
Yeah,
you did it.
yeah.
You
But
you had that idea.
But he was immediately like, we got to do that. That is great. And it just happened to coincide with me, chatting with some other people in the Chicago gaming community and, you know, realizing that there was a studio that we could use at the new Cards Against Humanity building. And I sort of pitched the idea to Max Temkin of Cards, and he later told me, yeah, I pretty much pitched it to him as I explained it to you. And he told me later, he was like, when you told me, I thought it was either going to be the best thing ever or the stupidest thing ever. And he was right on both counts. So we just kind of lucked out that we were able to have a studio that made it sound good, because that's very, it's at least, it's very important, and I'm saying that as someone currently in a room where the sound is not very good. So I'm sorry.
Well, Ryan appreciates you saying that, who makes sure that we sound good.
Right. And Ryan actually was here when you did your episode with Chris Perkins. You did it in this very room where we are now.
At that very table. It was so fun. Chris Perkins was so funny and so like game kind of to do anything, and so committed. It's pretty good jump on episode too. If you people can listen to, it's fun to listen to our podcast from the beginning and get all the things as they build, but you can also usually just kind of jump in.
Yeah.
And the one he did a couple months ago where he played a Modron, I think, right?
Yep.
That we eventually started calling named Wee Woo, was so funny. Like it was so weird. And we, he surprised us. And we like threw all kinds of dumb things at him that he rolled with all the dumb jokes and somehow elevated them to still somehow be like smart versions of those dumb.
That's his superpower.
It really is. Yeah, he's from doing Acquisitions Incorporated and things like that. But there's a a large dumb joke to smart joke ratio, but he always elevates it.
Yeah, a lot of improv.
My favorite bit in that was when I don't want to give spoilers, but his voice changes in the middle of it, and I remember listening to that in the car driving to work here and just laughing out loud because I was like, oh yes, that's exactly what would happen, and it was the perfect kind of turn in the middle there.
Well, my favorite thing about it was like he what we do with our guests is we usually have them pitch like maybe 3 ideas over email, just very simple, like a sentence. Like we don't need to know like the whole. We don't like. It's fun to discover it in the room, but just like so we know like oh, okay, well we've already done something like that, or I don't know, we're planning on, or we've done too many wizards or something like that. So he we knew loosely what he was going to be, but then in the room it was so funny. Like at first he had no language. Like he was a part organic, part computer creature that was just like chirping words back at us as it was trying to learn language, in what is probably a very like smart, like dungeon master type thing, almost as like a puzzle, right? For the player to solve, like how do we get this being enough language? But it was very funny, like in the room as we're sort of like doing the show, like, and this goes on for a few minutes. And I think in the back of our heads we're like, is it gonna be this the whole time?
Yeah, right. Can we sustain this joke for an hour?
Are we gonna be like, everybody tune into our Chris Perkins episode, and it's just sort of like beep, beep.
It's like if they tuned into Dragon Talk and it was just Shelley's voices or bananas coming out of her butts. Or 2 buttholes, since we're wizards.
One is for where the bananas come out.
It's canon. Exactly. This is now Dragon Talk canon.
Where do you think bananas come from?
Wizards' buttholes.
Exactly.
That's how they were invented.
Yep, I love it.
So how did you come up with the idea for Foon as a whole? Or is it just something you said in the first episode when you recorded it and it was canon from then, or what?
The world itself, I mean, I think we just wanted to be this idea of just like a big, almost like cliched, but not in a bad way, sort of like starting with an idea of like, it's fantasy, it's a fantasy land. There is like a looming threat from the Dark Lord, and there are a few kingdoms and things. And, there's a tavern on the Traveler's Road. But we kind of wanted to leave it open enough that it could encompass kind of any and all fantasy cliches, So if we wanted to do an episode that's like, let's really kind of pull some of the things that we think are funny from, like, say, Legend of Zelda, and have a character who's like a little imp that poops coins into jars all the time, and that's where all the money comes from. Or we want to pull things from Game of Thrones, and like have, like, instead of like a Joffrey character, we have like a princess who just is angry and dangerous and wants to kill her whole family. And sometimes just pulling from fairy tale stuff, and just so a world that can just as much have high fantasy and low fantasy, and like, so that was basically that. As for the name, I just tried to think of like simple to say fantasy sounding things. And I think Foon, I don't remember even how I came up with Foon, but we did have that before we started.
That's funny that you said that, because that was going to be my question, is that every now and again, something is so appropriately named that I feel like there's got to be a story behind that. Because when you just hear Foon, I feel like I already know.
Yeah, because it's got like even though it doesn't sound anything like Narnia, it's got that feeling of like it's childlike.
Yes, and like not serious,
but also alien and strange and fantastical.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was a perfect happenstance somehow
it worked.
It could have gone either way, as Max Temkin said.
Well, thank you. I'll take it. I think for a second I wanted to do something like Twool or something, like, that kind of like almost hard to say, kind of like TW sort of
with lots of apostrophes and X's.
Yeah, but then I decided no, let's make it simpler on ourselves. We did go through a long run of episodes where all of our guests had character names that were like impossible to spell or spell them. And boy, whenever it's like I need to tweet about one of those characters coming back, I'm like, how do you spell Genlevia in the weird specific way that the character said they spell their name?
And you got to go back and listen and like get all the letters that were just improvised in a random order.
Of course, the character has a specific way.
Of course. So
who are the guests that you usually, or that you have? How do you choose who's going to be on the show and what role they're going to play?
A lot of it, from the very beginning, a lot of it is just pulling from people we know in the Chicago improv community. We were very blessed to have like a lot of really amazing performers here. And we'd been around for a long time, so we knew a lot of people. So to start, it was just, we sort of began by just bringing in people that we had performed with that we just knew were really funny. And sort of the main thing we would think about who to bring in was sort of just trying to make sure we had a variety of energies almost, so it would be sort of like, well, that last episode was very heady, or was very was sort of like a very thinky, like satirical take on something in fantasy. Let's just have someone we know that has just like a big funny energy, and and then they come on and just play like a drunken flower, like an angry drunken flower. So then after that, you just kind of are always trying to like find a balance of things like that. Or you're sort of like, we haven't really dug deep into some good like fantasy cliches in a while. Let's sort of bring in someone that's really, really into fantasy. Or, let's bring in a really good actor and sort of see what they're going to do. So that's sort of how we do a lot of that. And then we've been really lucky, like as we've sort of grown, we've been able to bring in like a lot of improvisers from other podcasts that we really love, or famous comedians that we're big fans of. Like I got to do a live show with Scott Adsit from 30 Rock, and he's always been like a performing hero of mine, and ended up doing this weird. He played like a turkey with a chicken with a duck in, like he was a turkey that had a chicken living inside of him and a duck living inside that.
A living turducken.
Yeah, he did all of the voices, and it somehow ended up where I had to barf food into his mouth.
See, because vomit's funny, apparently.
Yeah. So stuff like that. But also, I really love to like also bring in people who aren't necessarily inherently known as comedy first. Chris Perkins I think is really funny, but also like it was great to bring him in. We had Felicia Day, who's also very funny. We've had her on, but also like Cory Doctorow, the writer,
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
and like played like a spider who does surveillance in the world. So he was able to bring all of that kind of like writing he does about like the dystopian places the internet is taking us, and sort of using that as sort of like a metaphor within the fantasy world. Um, Gosh, Patrick Rothfuss, we've had on playing like a doctor. Um, we've had wrestlers on. We had Colt Cabana on, who was very funny, who just played like a bear. He played a human with a bear's body, but it's not exactly like a centaur. It's like a full bear, and then instead of just a human head, it's like a torso
Oh
of a
my
human coming out of that. It was very strange, and he was great.
Did
That's
he
awesome.
come up with that character, or did you give him that character?
I think it's a combination. Like he came up with this idea of being. I think he wanted to be something called the Brotar, who was, and we are like, great, we'll sort of discover it from there.
The
And
bear
then
tar.
yeah, and then just in talking to him as he was like explaining his body, like we realized like it wasn't making sense, and so we just discovered in the moment that the way he was explaining it sounded like if a centaur, if the horse part was a bear, but that just looks really weird. And so we're just sort of like, that was the funniest thing in the moment, so we just kept rolling with it, and that's kind of where the funnest stuff comes from.
My favorite one. I mean, I by no means have I listened to all 200 episodes, but yeah, a dozen or two that I really have enjoyed over the years. But the villains that you kind of bring on are really funny, like Drip Fang and things like that, because you guys are ostensibly good aligned people, fighting against the Dark Lord. But then you bring on these you interview people who are these evil aligned characters, but it's all under the guise of it being this interview. So like you can't really attack them or do anything like that, but they're like, we don't like each other, but you're a good guy and you'll come back, right, to the next podcast.
Yeah, I mean the villains are the best. I mean the villains are just the best. Like it's so fun. It's got to be so fun to play the villain. Kevin Soretta, who plays Drip Fang, is so fun. He's just like a necromancer that's actually just like made of snakes, but he's just this but he's just this weird, like he's just like a bunch of snakes combined into like an outfit, and then they just like always like bangs into the tavern, being like, "Everyone, shut up!" and like, and just sort of makes dramatic proclamations. And so that, first of all, is just really fun. Just having that big, fun energy,
Mm-hmm.
and he's so funny. But then I also, one of my favorite things is like really always coming back to the sort of weird quality of it being an interview, and especially when like a villain comes back,
Yeah.
where it's sort of like I am here I'm here to kill you all. All right, but would you please speak into the microphone? And it's so great to have you back on the show. Stuff like that is really fun.
And it reminds me of like The Onion a little bit in that, obviously another Midwest Chicago institution, and that it what's great about that publication is that it uses all the tropes of news writing, but subverts it for comedy purposes. And you guys are doing the same thing as this like news interview show, but with this, using all the forms that make it funny. Exactly. I don't know. I see a lot of parallels.
I've always been I mean, it's almost a bit of a cliche, but I've always been a big fan of like where the fantastic meets the mundane.
Yeah.
I think that's like where really funny things can happen, or just interesting things. And so it was very intentional, like making it about a host that was just overly invested in having a podcast, because it's just this physical thing that you can always kind of come back to and remind yourself that like it can make these weird moments where the stakes are so high, but they're also so low in a weird way, where like a town is being taken over, but the host is really worried that he's not going to be able to get good sound. Like,
while all of the people are being murdered outside, you're like, God, can you just keep it down? Yeah. And I just love the weird logical things you have. I think it doesn't Usador like charge your laptop with lightning bolt spells and things like that in order to continue it going.
Yeah. I just love that there's like the weak Wi-Fi, a signal still coming from the Burger King.
Do you have to go back and keep continuing to buy things at the Burger King to keep the Wi-Fi signal alive?
No one. Here's the funny thing: we've gotten so many questions. We've gotten so many emails from people asking about things about the Wi-Fi. Definitely asking how we charge the laptop. And you're right. Usador uses what he calls minuscule lightning. I think that he just shoots at the laptop to charge it every once in a while. But no one has ever asked whether we have to like re-up our Wi-Fi time with the Burger King. I would posit that we don't know for sure. Like we think it's coming from the Burger King, but maybe it's someone pretending that it's Wi-Fi from the Burger King. And I'm saying that as if that's a real clue, but I don't know. I'm just making that up.
The Dark Lord has been the Burger King this whole time.
Yeah.
And then he gives his people free Wi-Fi.
Yeah, exactly. Or that there's.
It's not so bad then.
Well, you do have, but through the emails, you have evidence that the podcast is listened by people in our world, right? That's like kind of the shtick. So it's
and we've even done runs of episodes where we're like trying to solve riddles in the tavern in the world, like there are things hidden in the tavern that we're trying to find, and trying to get people, listeners to try to solve them and send in things. We've tried hiding things in around Chicago for people to find.
In real life.
Way,
I was
really?
wondering about Burger King traffic in the Chicago area.
It's very high.
It's also
sniffing around trying to find a portal.
It is actually, we do call out a specific Burger King as the Burger King. It's at the corner of Irving and Clark in Chicago, which because it's just the one that was relatively close to the Improv theater we used to perform at a lot. And people when people visit Chicago, they always tweet at us like, "We're at the Burger King," with like pictures of them.
Nothing's happening.
And then if you visit the Yelp page of that Burger King, which I did not know was a thing, but apparently there are specific Yelp reviews for specific Burger Kings or fast food restaurants. But people are always adding like Yelp reviews of that Burger King being like, "It was great. I walked to the back and suddenly, I got a mead and there was a dragon."
No way.
Put in these like in jokes about it in the
Yelp reviews. That's so funny.
Reviews, which is great.
That's amazing.
I love that. I love the hiding of things in real physical locations for super fans. Like, you can have a lot more fun with that too. I don't know. Cool.
It's very cool.
I want to jump in and start organizing that with you. And as a game designer, I bet you're like, oh, this is gonna be fun too.
Oh yeah. I mean, if only we had. I mean, I would have loved to have gone fully down the whole real life game, like real world game track. And if only we weren't all a bunch of people with full-time jobs, and I've got like a 4-year-old, so if only but that would have been so fun, right? Like just like a game for everyone to kind of try to solve, like in parallel with the show itself. That's cool.
Maybe a future season you can kind of like organize around that. That'd be really cool.
Have you ever, as a game designer who doesn't have any time to do this, I acknowledge, but have you ever thought about taking it to a different platform and maybe like turning Foon into a real campaign setting that people could play in outside of their imaginations?
I think that would be fantastic. I think it's a combination, and we've had some, like we've talked a bit about it. Like we've gotten some offers to do various things. Some things we can talk about, some things we can't. So I generally just
don't talk about them.
Because I feel like if there's certain things you're like, I can talk about everything, but I can't talk about this thing because that's the real thing.
Yeah.
But I think that would be great. We also had a brief spin-off podcast. Where the role-playing game in the world of Foon is Offices and Bosses, where a wizard is very excited to play a marketing manager as his and we did we've done 2 short seasons of that on Stitcher Premium, and that is a lot of fun, and a lot of people have been like, I would love to play Offices and Bosses module. We're totally into it. We just gotta find the time.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, we don't know anyone who can help out with that. Maybe Shelley.
Don't know.
Really fun stuff. If people haven't, you mentioned the Chris Perkins episode is a good drop in, and I think it's true too. I don't think you guys go too far down into the story, but really any episode you can kind of jump in because it's such light touch continuity that part of the fun is
every once in a while there's a real crazy one, but most of the episodes, like part of the joke of the show is also like we do a lot of signposting and recapping and exposition stuff because again, like my character wants to boost the listener numbers of the podcast in a magical world. So someone might be like, oh gosh, my whole town, I'm really not doing well. My whole town was destroyed. And the host is like, yeah, and for new listeners, your town was destroyed by a big dragon that killed everybody. I'm so sorry. Which is kind of a fun sort of.
Right. It falls into the interview trope type thing as well. But that's awesome. So, where's the best way for people to jump in if they want to for Hello from the Magic Tavern? Not like as a website URL type stuff.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can go to hellofromthemagictavern.com or, you can just go and search Hello from the Magic Tavern and whatever, Apple Podcast, Stitcher, whatever podcatcher you use. And look around for one that looks appealing by title, or if you're really like, I'm in for a long journey of things, you can start at the first episode and go from there. There's no wrong way to do it. It's not The Wire.
That's your tagline from now on. We're not The Wire.
Yeah.
And what about you yourself? How can people find out about Arnie and what you're doing?
You can follow me at Mr. Arnie, Mr. spelled out, MisterArnie on Twitter. You can follow Jackbox Games on Twitter as well to see what games we're working on for next year. We're working on some really cool stuff for the coming year. Those are really the best places.
Awesome.
Okay.
Well, thanks for coming on. Always great to hear about creative podcasts, and this is one of the ones that I think definitely struck a nerve, and I think a lot of our listeners will dig. So hopefully people jump in, and then we'll see a whole bunch of magical land of the Forgotten Realms podcasts and things. As the pho shop in Renton here has got a dimensional rift going on, probably too.
Maybe.
Thank you so much for having me on, and it was so good to talk to you again.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you later, Arnie.
Thanks, Arnie.
Bye-bye. Such fun stuff. We are going to take a break, and then Shelly's going to get out of here.
Bye.
No more bananas or crying out the eyes.
No, I held it together.
You did hold it together, which is weird because I think, as one of the funniest people we've had on here, that was an actual very informative and serious interview.
Trying to be professional.
It worked. C-3PO.
Oh, dear.
Oh, dear. We're going to take a little break and then come back with Mr. Chris Perkins to talk about some lore without Shelley. So goodbye, Shelley.
And talk about his experience being on this podcast.
Yes, playing Wee Woo, the Modron.
Wee Woo, Wee Woo, Wee Woo.
Sounded very much like that. Yeah, jump in if you can.
Okay.
All right, thanks, everybody. We'll be back in a second.
Bye.
Bye.